We're now joined by former Conservative Party chair, Baroness Warsi, and founder of Operation Black Vote and equality campaigner, Lord Woolley. Let's come to you first of all, Lord Woolley. It is very hard to watch, isn't it? It's unbelievable to me that we're seeing people expressing that kind of fear, exposed to that kind of violence here in 2024. I'm sure it's equally distressing to you, but are you surprised by it?
Well, I'm heartbroken by what we've just heard, that people literally live in fear for their lives and for their children. This is the gross exploitation of an utter tragedy. And for far-right fascists to use this to divide and rule and to scare a nation, that I'm a child of the 70s, and I remember the skinheads rampaging through the streets of Leicester. And I remember as a 10-year-old child being struck by fear when I saw a Muslim, a Sikh man, he had a turban, being knocked to the ground and blood pouring from its head. That stayed with me all these years. And, we should be putting an arm around Southport and the families that have had this tragedy, losing loved ones, many more injured. Instead, we're talking about terrorism on our streets. When you plan an arson with people living above, that is an act of terrorism. And another point I want to make is this: what our communities strongly feel. If this teenager who did these heinous crimes was a white teenager, a race wouldn't be blamed, a religion wouldn't be blamed, asylum seekers wouldn't be blamed. This is exploitation at its worst. And it's time for a nation to say, not in our name. You don't protest.
Can I ask you, Lord Woolley, because I entirely echo all those sentiments. And it's terrible to see the way in which the terrible murders last week have been exploited with lies by people who are seeking to riot.
Right.
But the fear that we saw in those interviews we were doing with people across the country, is that a fear which you think has particularly risen within people in the last 7 days? Or has something been happening in our country for a longer period of time, for months or even years, which means that, almost independent of the terrible event in Southport, was happening anywhere and that we haven't been understanding or addressing?
I'm afraid so, Ed. You are right. I mean, when you think about... I don't want us to go down a cul-de-sac with this conversation, but there was a strong xenophobic strain within the Brexit narrative that said we're being invaded by foreigners, we're being ruled by foreigners. And when people are looking for simple answers to complex situations, these comments land, rather than saying, actually, we failed white working class communities because we haven't built the infrastructure so they can thrive and become active citizens. When people go into those communities and spread lies and in effect say, Ed, you're poor because of those black and brown people. You have no housing because of those. It is shocking divide and rule. And I hope during these conversations, Ed, and you've got the wonderful Susanna Reid there too, that we talk about how we bring our communities together, that how we support each other. We've seen wonderful white allies clearing up the streets, saying this is not in our name. We're a better nation than these thugs on the street.
Can I ask Baroness Warsi, because I feel a real dilemma about this, because on the one hand, the thing which we want to do, and the people of Southport want to do, is to unite, whether you are Labour or Conservative, whether you are white or black or Muslim, whether you, whatever your religion, to say, no, we stand against the violence, the riots, the far-right extremism we're seeing on our streets, and to come together in opposing it. But then also, once you start the conversation about, well, what has gone wrong over a longer period of time than just the last week, it suddenly raises challenging issues for us and divides within that mainstream. You know, a need for many people in the mainstream to say it was partly our fault.
Yeah. These are difficult questions, and these are difficult questions that we haven't been asking, and we certainly haven't been providing a solution to. I mean, I would say that certainly over the last decade, government has methodically dismantled practically anything that exists in relation to cohesion and integration. When austerity came about, and it was under my government, it was under my party that this happened, it was the first place where the cuts hit. We haven't had an integration and cohesion policy, a coherent integration and cohesion policy for, like I said, almost a decade. There are no initiatives out there. And if you basically take away the fabric of how people come together, and then you poison the public discourse, particularly around immigrants, refugees, Muslims, what we're seeing on the streets does not surprise me at all. This has been a long time coming. It's very difficult,
though, for us sometimes to talk about that, isn't it? And, you know, we personally, Ed and I, when we've been involved in interviews where this has been raised, have been criticised for in some way then letting the rioters off for wanton, violent and criminal behaviour. So it's quite a dilemma to be able to focus on the horrific scenes and at the same time try and have a debate about how to prevent them happening again.
Yeah, I mean, I've consistently said that dialogue has got to be the basis of everything. Even when we had, you know, terrorism on the streets of London post 7/7, one of the things I said is deal with the criminality, but also deal with the underlying grievances that communities talk about. You know, when we had communities who were saying, let's not go to war in Iraq, and millions took to the streets because this is an illegal war and we're concerned about it, that was an underlying issue that we should have been prepared to discuss. So I think in this case as well, as somebody who comes from the north of England, right, who's spent all her life campaigning in towns where we've had the rise of the BNP, the rise of the EDL, the rise of other far-right extremist groups, I went on Question Time and took on Nick Griffin. You know, I honestly believe that the way you deal with bad ideas is by putting forward good ideas, the way in which you bring our nation together. And remember, I come from a family that has fought fascism all its life. I had two grandfathers who served in the British Indian Army. They were part of the Second World War Allied effort to keep fascism out of these shores. You know, I come from a family which has helped build Britain after the war, as have many ethnic minority communities. And I just refuse to accept that there is this sense of us and them. Our country, which belongs to all of us, which we have all helped build, which we have all helped defend, is something that believes in inclusive, liberal values. And we cannot have mobs on the street.
But we have to.
No, we haven't. That by race and religion.
You've written a book specifically about this, haven't you? About your concern over Islamophobia, which you say is experienced in the most respected homes. Give us an example of why you argue that.
Well, back in 2011, when I was actually in Cabinet as a government minister, I made this very keynote speech where I said Islamophobia has passed the dinner table test. And what I meant by that was that, you know, having grown up like Simon in the 70s, where unfortunately P-bashing was something that you all, you know, saw and experienced. Now what I was seeing in the respectable spaces like the corridors of power, like think tanks, like briefing rooms, you know, like media rooms, like front pages of papers, the demonisation of migrants, particularly Muslim communities, was very deliberate. This is a policy that has been put forward by some sections of the media, some sections of politics and some sections of the think tank world. This is deliberate. It has been done over a period of time. And what we're seeing now on the streets is the outcome of that. So I think when the government responds to this, they absolutely have to be brave enough to say, well, where has this really come from? Who's been feeding this beast? Who has created the racist rhetoric? Who's poisoned the public discourse?
Can we go back to Lord Woolley? When Saida talks about that rise of Islamophobia in the mainstream, around dinner tables, in think tanks, in parts of the media over, you know, she's saying 13 years. Is that right? Is that what you've seen?
No, it is. It's been a drip. And, you know, actually the reality is, let's take the last month, for example. You know, we're seeing the football Euros, multiculturalism, multicultural society at its best. We've been watching the Olympic Games, multicultural society at its very best. You know, if you want to see the best of multicultural society, Ed, walk into any hospital. When you go into a hospital at your lowest, who's going to put you back together? I would argue the best of multicultural society. Let's talk about what we do well. Let's face down the bigotry. Let's look at our parliament, the most multicultural parliament actually in Western democracies. This is what we do well, and we must not, Ed and Kate, allow a poisonous tiny minority to say you're good and you're bad. We want to firebomb you out of existence. We've got to resist that. We've got to pull together. We've got to show what we do well. Ed, we've got to show leadership.
Lord Woolley, thank you very much indeed for those words, and to Baroness Warsi as well. You have a book coming out in October called?
Muslims Don't Matter. Interestingly, I started writing it earlier this year, and it just seems to be so tragically timely, you know, mapping all of this and warning that this is coming.
We look forward to you coming back and telling us about the book when it comes out.